The bright side of addiction is recovery. And recovery is an American way of life. If you're new to our podcast, we welcome you. If you have been here before, welcome back. And if you're in recovery or know or love someone who is, or you simply want to know more about the recovery process, or maybe you're a bit concerned about someone you know or love who harmfully uses alcohol or any other drug, this is the podcast for you, as we carry the message of hope and the promise of recovery. And a reminder that you can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. Recent episodes have featured NFL players Ryan Leaf and Thomas Hollywood Henderson, musician Bonnie Raitt, authors Brene Brown, Anne Lamott, J.A. Jantz, actor John Larroquette, and astronaut Buzz Aldrin. All these interviews and more on our website, plus conversations with everyday people in long-term recovery, sharing their story, their insight, and their path. Now, in this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, a very special edition, we are going to take you to the East Room of the White House, where a new stamp was unveiled of former First Lady of the United States and the First Lady of Addiction, Treatment, and Recovery, Mrs. Betty Ford. We'll bring you highlights from this incredibly special ceremony with comments by the Postmaster General, the President and CEO of Hazelden Betty Ford, Mrs. Ford's daughter Susan, and First Lady Dr. Jill Biden. It was a monumental event, and we will have it for you. Here is a quick clip from today's podcast and First Lady Jill Biden.
After Mrs. Ford left the White House, she bared her soul once more, revealing her battle with addiction. Just as she had done many times before, she brought light into a place of darkness, sharing her own demons, giving countless others the strength to confront their own. You have to give it away to keep it.
We will have Dr. Jill Biden's full speech, along with comments from Susan Bales Ford, Mrs. Ford's daughter, and Dr. Joseph Lee, President and CEO of Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, plus the Postmaster General, all coming up. Plus an excerpt from an exclusive interview that I did with Mrs. Ford some 41 years ago. In fact, you can hear that interview in its entirety at recoverycoasttocoast.org. I'm Neil Scott, host of Recovery Coast to Coast, and so very thankful and grateful that you have allowed us into your car, your phone, your computer, whatever electronic device you happen to hear it on. There's a lot of podcasts out there on recovery, and I'm just very grateful that you've chosen ours to listen to right here, right now. Our website, recoverycoasttocoast.org. Following 17 years of nightly broadcasting on iHeartRadio in Seattle, our podcast features interviews with everyday people in recovery, as well as clinicians, authors, recovering celebrities, all who offer the promise of hope and the reality of recovery, plus well-vetted resources for individuals, families, and friends. We invite you to enjoy the podcast and to share it with at least one of your friends as well. Recovery is an American way of life. And if you'd like to help us out financially or know of a foundation that might be interested in underwriting our program, we would be so grateful. Our email address, recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. We'd love to hear from you. Recovery Coast to Coast is supported by Sundown M Ranch, one of America's oldest, least expensive, and most successful treatment programs. Now, Sundown is nationally recognized for its quality programs and professional caregivers. Their innovative program utilizes a multidisciplinary team of certified counselors and medical professionals. There are three main objectives of treatment at Sundown. First of all, they arrest the disease. Secondly, they provide needed support in the recovery process. And third, they work with each individual as they go back into their respective communities, giving them the tools necessary to ensure a productive and healthy lifestyle. Now, these objectives have been the backbone of treatment at Sundown for the past 55 years. They have successfully treated close to 200,000 individuals, adolescents, and families. They are founding members of NAATP, which is important, the National Association of Addiction Treatment Providers, and they adhere to the organization's strict ethical guidelines. Treatment at Sundown is abstinence-based and 12-step centered. They provide detox, education, individual therapy, group therapy, exercise programs, a comprehensive family program, and a continuing care program following inpatient treatment. They don't simply treat and release. And since alcohol and other drugs are often not the only problems, Sundown is professionally trained to deal with co-occurring mental health issues. Sundown is a not-for-profit treatment program with the bottom line of long-term recovery, located on 30 acres right near the mouth of the beautiful Yakima River Canyon in central Washington. Take a look-see at their facility at sundown.org/gallery. It is where recovery begins. Well, I'm pouring myself a nice big cup of coffee, and I'm excited to take you inside the White House with me for a very special event hosted by First Lady Jill Biden, as they unveiled a new forever stamp first-class postage paying tribute to Betty Ford. You'll hear from the U.S. Postmaster General, along with Betty Ford's daughter, Susan, and Dr. Joseph Lee. He is the president and CEO of the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. I was at the 1981 unveiling of the very first alcoholism stamp, which included the logo of the National Council on Alcoholism. And I have long felt that there should be another stamp reflecting addiction and recovery in honoring Mrs. Betty Ford, the true First Lady of alcoholism treatment and recovery. And at the end of the podcast, I'm going to play a short segment of that exclusive interview that I did with Mrs. Ford, over 40 years ago, prior to the start of the Betty Ford Center. By the way, you can find that entire interview on our website. Just go to recoverycoasttocoast.org and search for Betty Ford. Now let's head to the White House and the official opening of the history-making event and remarks from the U.S. Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy.
The First Lady of the United States, accompanied by Postmaster General Louis DeJoy, Susan Ford Bales, and Dr. Joseph Lee.
I have the distinct pleasure of announcing that the United States Postal Service will issue a first-class mail forever stamp honoring the life and legacy of First Lady Betty Ford. Through our stamp program, the Postal Service commemorates and celebrates the very best of America. Betty Ford was a remarkable First Lady and a remarkable person, and she represents the very best of America. In many ways, Betty Ford changed the role of being that First Lady. Our nation certainly benefited from her voice and her views. Few people in the public eye today would open up about their private struggles with painkiller addiction. And yet, in 1978, Betty Ford brought attention to her private problem and her recovery to lift the veil of shame. She did so for the benefit of all those suffering. She later helped establish the Betty Ford Center, lending her name and energies to spark greater visibility for the drug rehabilitation services that were so widely needed then and unfortunately now. Betty Ford was a force for good, and her weapons were openness and honesty. To recognize her many contributions to our nation, we will officially issue the Betty Ford Commemorative Forever postage stamp on April 5th. The Postal Service is proud to honor First Lady Betty Ford.
Dr. Joseph Lee, President and CEO of the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, also addressed those assembled in the East Room of the White House.
If I can leave you with one thing today, it's this: the Betty Ford spirit is alive and well. Her influence continues to loom large, just as her elegant image does in this room today. At the Betty Ford Center in California, right now, patients and their family members are walking the same grounds that Mrs. Ford walked for nearly 3 decades. They are beginning to break through, overcoming substance use and mental health challenges. They are transforming their lives with possibilities beyond the imagination. Today, Betty Ford's impact extends through an entire national network of Hazelden Betty Ford treatment sites, as well as a graduate school, a research center, a publishing arm. We work very hard to be the best and to do so with love, because that is the standard she set for us. On behalf of our board and employees and all the patients and families touched by Mrs. Ford's leadership, We are so proud and privileged to carry forward her legacy. In this country, as we all know, we are still facing tremendous stigma with regard to mental health and substance use issues. But Betty Ford made sure that addiction was not seen as a second-class illness for second-class citizens. Instead, she sent a powerful message that everyone on the journey of recovery deserves dignity and quality health care. That's a message I hope will be conveyed every time someone uses this stamp and sees it on an envelope. And even more broadly, I hope the stamp sends an optimistic message to everyone that we can overcome difficult challenges that impact our families and communities by working together. In the spirit of Mrs. Ford's impact across America, we at Hazel and Betty Ford are proud to announce our 75th anniversary this year, and we'll save a seat for anyone who wants to join us in September. There are times throughout history when courageous people stand up, and when courageous people stand up, they change the conversation for the entire country. Betty Ford did that for breast cancer and for addiction. Where there was only shame and loneliness and despair, she replaced it with hope and dignity and compassion and community and equity. For the first time, due to her actions and her words, millions of people across the country felt seen, felt heard for the very first time. That is why Betty Ford is a national treasure. And that is why all of us feel inspired for a lifetime to carry on that charge.
Dr. Lee is a tireless advocate for quality treatment and long-term recovery. Mrs. Ford's daughter, Susan Bales Ford, was on hand. She was introduced to share some reflections on living in the White House with her mom and dad and the impact that her mom, Betty Ford, had on America.
Dr. Biden, Postmaster General DeJoy, Dr. Lee, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, what an exciting day. Thank you to the Postmaster General DeJoy and the United States Postal Service. The stamp, in a word, is beautiful. Mom would be so happy with it. So on behalf of Mom, my heartfelt gratitude goes to everyone at the Postal Service for making this stamp a shining example. Dr. Biden, I cannot express how grateful I am for your kindness in hosting this ceremony. Thank you for your great works here in America and around the world that you carry out with such strength and grace. Mom and Dad would be so proud, as I am, that you are our nation's First Lady. Thank you, Dr. Biden, from the bottom of my heart. Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be back home. But it's also really exciting to be back in the East Room. This room is where my high school classmates and I held our senior prom. And a reminder, all the information about the after prom party up on the 3rd floor that night is still highly classified. It is super duper top secret. Not even the president knows. But return with me now to an autumn afternoon in 1974 to a small room upstairs in the family quarters. That afternoon, my exciting life in the White House was shattered. My mother took me aside and whispered 4 words to me: I have breast cancer. And in those days, her diagnosis was grim. Mom likely was going to die. But the unavoidable fear, the kind that reaches down into the pit of your stomach, was wrenching. And just because we were sitting here in the White House and Mom, the First Lady, didn't help one bit. I recall Mom's conversation with Dad and me about whether to share her diagnosis and mastectomy with the public. Should she announce that she has cancer? Should anyone, much less the First Lady, dare say the word breast in public? How much should we talk about this? Something so personal to any woman, cancer of the breast. My mom's reaction was swift. No way. Mom ought to be able to deal with this privately with her life-threatening diagnosis. I wanted her to do what so many other women had done, simply mention that she was having so-called female problems and would undergo exploratory surgery. She bluntly disagreed. She said, "The time for women hiding this disease in shame and behind closed doors has to stop. And who better to make that happen than the First Lady of the United States? So Mom announced to the public exactly, and I mean exactly, what was happening to her. She took the brave yet controversial step and told the world the truth about her disease. And with those same 4 words, she whispered to me, my mom announced that she had breast cancer. Instantly, the arc of women's health and the future lives of tens of millions of women has been changed forever. And in addition, the moment marked a permanent transformation of the role and the public expectations of our First Ladies. 4 years later, Dad and our family had another jarring conversation with Mom. We explained to her the devastating effects that her addiction in prescription pain medicines and alcohol were having on Mom and all of us. She bravely entered treatment, and the rest of it, as they say, is history. Back then, stigma of prescription and alcohol addiction was cynical, as it was cruel. Most often, it was confused incorrectly with individual moral failure, and a failure caused solely by personal choice. Nevertheless, Mom refused to hide in the dark of secrecy and shame. Instead, she went public, and oh, do I mean she went public. She candidly discussed her condition and treatment. She demonstrated by word and deed that in seeking treatment, what some might call for personal weakness is in truth the hopeful pathway to renewal. But Mom didn't stop with her public announcement. She and Ambassador Firestone created the Betty Ford Center, a treatment facility that 4 decades ago is still recognized around the globe as a gold standard for treatment and of those suffering from substance use disorder, and most importantly, for their families and their children. In reflecting on Mom's enduring legacy, historian Richard Norton Smith concluded, where women's health issues are concerned, the American history is divided in 2 very unequal periods, before Betty and after Betty. Today, the Postal Service and the American people pay tribute to a woman of extraordinary courage and candor, to a transformative First Lady, and to a devoted wife. And in doing so, they honor a woman that today and in every tomorrow, I am so proud to call my mom. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me in this tribute. So in closing, please permit me a personal reflection, recalling the words of President John Adams etched on the fireplace mantel just down the hall. I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, on the First Lady, Jill Biden, and President Joe Biden, and the entire First family. May God bless and keep you all safe, and the men and women of the Postal Service and the nation that they serve with dedication and integrity. And may God's perpetual light watch over Betty Ford and her husband, Gerald R. Ford. Thank you all very, very much.
Following Susan Ford Bales' touching tribute to her mother, former First Lady Betty Ford, current First Lady Dr. Jill Biden spoke of Betty Ford's candor and courage.
Thank you, Susan. In your words and in your career, it's clear how much of your mom's humor, strength, and love for this country lives on in you. And I'm also grateful to have many other members of the Ford family with us today. I know we have several of First Lady Ford's friends here as well. So thank you all so much for joining us. Postmaster General DeJoy, that stamp is beautiful, it's spectacular. And Dr. Lee and the rest of the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, I'm grateful that you're carrying on Betty Ford's work. So I'm excited to welcome all of you to the White House for this special moment. You know, there is no roadmap for becoming a First Lady, let alone becoming one overnight, as she did with everything in her life. Betty Ford threw herself into the new role. And I'm quoting her, "If we have to go to the White House, okay, I will go," Mrs. Ford told her husband, "but I'm going as myself. And if they don't like it, they'll just have to throw me out." It turned out that Betty, as herself, was her trademark candor, wit, and lack of pretense. And that was exactly what the country needed. A warm, charming, friendly First Lady who would help restore a weary nation's faith in government. Betty's time in the White House may have been brief, but her mark was lasting. She was unafraid to speak her mind. She supported legalized abortion and was a vocal advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment. When her husband's senior advisors complained about Betty placing calls from the White House lobby to the ERA, she installed her own personal phone line. And in a remarkable display of courage and vulnerability, she went public about her breast cancer and mastectomy at a time when things were just only whispered about. And as she lay in a hospital bed in Bethesda, she watched news programs beaming footage of women lining up at hospitals to get their screenings too. She didn't think, what she did was revolutionary. She was simply being Betty. Forthright, honest, and relatable. Countless women would owe their lives to following her example. After Mrs. Ford left the White House, she bared her soul once more, revealing her battle with addiction. Just as she had done many times before, she brought light into a place of darkness, sharing her own demons, giving countless others the strength to confront their own. You have to give it away to keep it. That mantra would become one of the guiding lights behind the creation of the Betty Ford Center. Mrs. Ford's extraordinary story is a lesson in the beautiful and sometimes cruel unpredictability of life and our capacity for redemption. Her journey reminds us that we are not defined by our worst moments, but rather by our ability to turn life's inevitable pain and struggle into purpose and salvation. Heroism is not perfection, it's resilience. Ultimately, Betty gave us hope. Hope that tomorrow is a brighter day. Hope that this too shall pass. Hope that even in the depths of despair, the human will is limitless. As many at the Betty Ford Center would say, if Betty can do it, I can do it. Mrs. Ford once wrote that to be remembered with joy is a kind of immortality. I'm sure if she were with us today, she would offer a witty quip about being immortalized with her own forever stamp. Susan, it is an honor to celebrate your mom today. She inspired a nation and captured our hearts for an eternity. Thank you.
What a historic day for people in recovery, as Mrs. Ford's stamp is unveiled at the White House in the East Room. Now Mrs. Ford's stamp will grace the envelopes that will travel around the world. Mrs. Ford, of course, became the face and voice of recovery with her candidness. And as I mentioned earlier, over 40 years ago, when I was the editor of Alcoholism and Addiction magazine, I was granted an exclusive interview with Mrs. Ford, one of the very first interviews that she gave following her treatment and early recovery. I was invited to the home of President and Mrs. Ford down in Rancho Mirage, California, where we chatted for, close to an hour. The interview was done in the very room where the historic intervention was done to facilitate Mrs. Ford going into treatment. When we come back, I will share a short clip from that interview.
We wasted a lot of years hoping, praying for things to get better. I was desperate to save our family. That's when I made the contact.
She contacted Sundown Am Ranch. Sundown's nationally recognized alcohol and drug treatment program teaches family members how to break down the barriers of denial. They are taught the skills needed to deal with addiction as a family.
Now we're making up for lost time. It was the best contact I ever made.
Go to www.sundown.org to learn more.
And now, as promised, here is a short piece from the interview that I did with Mrs. Ford. You can hear the entire interview at our website, recoverycoasttocoast.org. Simply type in Betty Ford in the search feature. And now here is a portion of that interview.
I was not aware that the family would be arriving that morning. No way was I aware of it. And yet, once they came in and we all sat down actually in this room, I knew that sort of they had come, well, the doctors were with them.
Mm-hmm.
And that had to give it away. I mean, I wasn't dumb. That more or less, I knew that they had medical men with them and that this was a very serious matter, because I can assure you nobody was smiling.
Well, I certainly hope you've enjoyed a portion of that interview. To access the entire interview, all you have to do is go to our website, recoverycoasttocoast.org, and search Betty Ford. To close out this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, let's get a thought for the day from award-winning actress Ali MacGraw, who reflects on courage and recovery, something Mrs. Ford had an amazing amount of.
As painful and unacceptable as our lives may have been, for quite some time it seemed easier to let things continue just as they were. It seemed easier to stay with the familiar, muddling through, barely coping, barely functioning. So we continued to make concessions and compromise our dreams. Year after year, as one example, many of us gave in to the frequently unreasonable or even outrageous demands of parents, partners, or others in our lives. It seemed easier to continue spiraling downward than to try to do something about our compulsions and addictions. So, day after tormenting day, many of us kept on doing the things that made us despise ourselves. It seemed easier to go on living in quiet desperation than to take the first step and reach out for help. It took courage, a great deal of courage, to make a commitment to getting well. It took courage to admit the scope of our problems and to surrender. It took courage to listen with an open mind and meet new friends. It took courage to choose a new direction and begin turning our lives around. Thought for today: recovery is the easier, softer way.
Well, that wraps up this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. If you've enjoyed our podcast, and we certainly hope you have, please share it with one other person. That would help us out immensely. You can find all of our podcasts, by the way, at recoverycoasttocoast.org. And if you'd like to get in touch, our email, recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. And also, please hit the subscribe or follow button. It's free, and you'll be notified the next time we publish a podcast. And remember, if you know someone who's experiencing problems with alcohol or any other drug, here's a 24-hour national helpline. It offers free information and confidential treatment referrals. Spanish-speaking individuals are available as well, 1-800-622-HELP. And we encourage you to check out findsupport.gov. That's a website designed for individuals, families, and friends. It has a lot of information, including how to pay for treatment, including low-cost and free treatment options. Find healthcare support there as well. how to help someone else, so find help for yourself. It's all in one place at findsupport.gov. And join us next time for America's Voice for Recovery, Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. And another quick shout out to our sponsoring organization, Sundown M Ranch, where recovery begins, sundown.org. I'm Neil Scott, reminding you to stay healthy, live in gratitude, and be kind to others. Remember, the bright side of addiction is recovery. Pass it on.